Today we're talking about interpersonal conflict you have with other people that I'm sure, anyone listening or watching is familiar with having conflict in their lives. And we're going to get into that in just a second, but be sure to, if you get any kind of value out of this episode, make sure to like and subscribe to our channels, and even check out our Patreon if that's something you think you want to do, help support us, help keep this show going. Anyway, I'm not going to spend much time on that. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Taylor Guthrie.
Awesome. Yeah. So like Andrew was just saying, like, I'm sure that everyone listening right now can relate with the fact that conflict in our lives is unavoidable, right? It shows up in all of our meaningful relationships with our partners, with our family, our coworkers, our friends, right? And most of us have this really strong aversion to the conflict process in general. It's something that's really scary to us. And a lot of it's based on our past experiences with conflict, something that made us feel disrespected, made us feel unrecognized, unseen, unheard, right? A lot of the times the conflict made things worse. Emotions were flaring. It felt uncomfortable in our bodies, right? The stress response is this huge uncomfortable response in our body. We have all of these emotions that are flaring, all of this, right? What I really want to try to do and really try to challenge everyone today to consider is that we want you to try to change the way that you're thinking about conflict, the way that you kind of conceptualize conflict. Because we all have this aversion, this idea that conflict is this really negative thing, this thing that should be avoided at all costs, right? But you need to realize that conflict is actually the main source of growth in relationships. It's the catalyst for change. Conflict is actually the signal that there's misalignment in the relationship, that our goals are not in tune with one another. And it's a signal that there's a need for communication, a need for healthy communication. And these negative experiences that we have are usually a result of mismanaged conflict, right? It's that we didn't communicate properly. We didn't talk about our needs and our values and all of these things that were under the surface from what we were actually talking about. And so what we're going to talk about today first is what the literature is really saying about the process of conflict, how it unfolds, what the different styles are based on our personality, based on past experiences, how we actually approach the conflict process in general, and what it's doing to our bodies and to our brains and how it affects our cognitive process. Because realizing all of these things can really help you to kind of take a step back, to understand how you can regulate these things, regulate these emotions, really bring yourself down in the moment, fight a lot of toxic advice that's out there, like don't go to sleep angry, because that's not good advice. We're not really good cognitively late at night. It's better to have these conversations when we can actually think through things, right? And so at the end, we'll really get into a lot of the strategies that are successful for regulating these things, for getting vulnerable, for taking ownership, the things that have been shown in the research as being successful to move things forward. Because the whole process, the whole point of conflict is to build structure in the relationship. It's to build boundaries. It's to make the relationship itself more predictable in the future. Because when we don't approach conflict, when we leave it under the surface and we just let it simmer and we avoid it or we yield, oftentimes that turns to resentment. It feels like a hot coal that we're holding on to. And we'll try to be kind of present and happy in our relationships, but there's always this elephant in the room, right? This avoided thing that we're just not touching and hoping that it just goes away. And so really the big challenge here is that if you can reconceptualize what conflict actually is, start to see it for what it is, start to see it as this positive source of growth, then you can really start to take different steps, try to learn a new language to approach it in a different way. And so that's my soapbox for the day.
Awesome. Yeah. So I guess to begin, we could dive into like what is conflict really, like more so where does it come from? Because what we all have these conflicts in our lives, but sometimes it's like when you step back and think, what is the source? What is common among all the conflicts we have? What's that common cause, like a sort of general abstract cause? What would you say that is, Taylor?
Yeah, I really like to, and this is not all like I'm not coming here saying that I'm an expert in conflict, right? I have my own issues. I've had my own issues this week with my partner, right? It's something that I want to take ownership for. But what a lot of the research shows is that conflict is like an iceberg. A lot of the times we're fighting about stuff that's that's way up here on the surface. Like you didn't do the dishes, you didn't fold the laundry, you didn't do your part on the assignment, or you're just not like respecting me at work. A lot of the times what the conflict is really about is our values. It's the things that we hold as being really important to us. And it's so when we fight about these surface level things like the dishes or about someone's contribution, all of these things, it really is about our value to be recognized. It's about our values of being respected, about having some type of competence that's recognized, about having some type of equal play in the relationship that we're a part of. And those deeper things are actually really hard to talk about. They're really hard to get vulnerable about, to take ownership ourselves. When you really think about values, I've actually, so like when I talk to my wife about like feelings, I'm like, pull out the feeling chart because my feeling vocabulary is terrible. Like I need words, I need examples. And I think that this same thing comes up with values. When you ask someone like, what do you value? What does your actual value vocabulary actually look like? Because you can download these worksheets that have like 100 examples on them that you can go through and you can look and say like, look, these are my top 5. And if there's 100 of them, there's a pretty good chance that your values and the person that you're fighting with have different values. And that's probably what the source of a lot of the conflict actually is.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of it is also just like misunderstanding what the other person's goals and values are in the situation, and like so almost like a lack of knowledge about what's going on with them and what their actual goals are. Because like it's it sounds like what you're saying is like when goals and values are misaligned, or when we don't know what the other person's goals or values are, and then we can't understand their behavior, and it's harder to navigate that conflict, right?
It's been a while since I've seen the statistics, so I'm paraphrasing right now, but I'm pretty sure that it was around 25% of the time we're right in assuming intent and assuming someone else's goals, someone else's like values, whatever it is. And that was done in romantic couples. And so much of the time, like 3/4 of the time, we think we know what that person wants. We think we know like what they're valuing, but so much of the time we're misinterpreting that. And we're putting malice on it. We're putting all of this negative intent. And a big thing that you were kind of hinting at, like what really defines conflict is that our goals are not aligned. And values are goals, right? We have a goal to be recognized. We have a goal to be respected, all of these things. And so this conflict, like I said earlier, is really this signal in the relationship that something is not aligned. And you can just ignore it. You can push it under the rug and hope that it just gets better somehow. But you really need to move that forward if you want to come to some type of resolution.
Yeah, because like the theme of this episode is really that conflict is not negative.
Yeah.
That like we avoid it, or just like don't even engage with it at all, because we're scared of losing something, right? That it seems like it's all risk and no reward, at least to many of us. I think that's like our predisposition toward conflict. At least for me, it often feels that way. And yeah, just to go back to something you said a minute ago, like, yeah, we're not pretending like we're conflict free or anything like that, because we're human, and we inevitably run into conflicts with the people we care about and people we don't care about. Like I was on the trail walking my dog the other day, and got into a very intense conflict with someone on the trail. I won't go into detail, but just to say that like it's it's a learning experience, and we're always practicing these things.
There's someone that was a big part of the research for this episode, Claire Canfield. He's got this amazing TED Talk where he talks about the beauty of conflict. And he really, in a lot of his research and a lot of his work, talks about this new approach being like learning a new language. That we really are the reason we've been so unsuccessful with conflict in the past. And we've had so many negative experiences. We've lost things in the process, like Andrew was saying, is because of our process, because of our technique going into that conflict itself. And so learning these new skills, it's not enough to just say, just talk about it, right? Because we've tried to talk about it and it didn't work, right? There's a specific type of way that you need to talk about it. There's a way that things need to be brought up. There's a certain amount of accountability and ownership that you need to do, right? And that's going to be a big part of this episode, is that so much of the time in our conflicts, we get stuck in this justification mode where we think that we're just completely blameless, that it's all this other person's fault. And really what that other person wants to see is us taking ownership too, is us saying, you know what, I'm not free of blame in this. Like, this is not happening in a vacuum, right? And we need to figure out how to both take accountability so that we can move this thing forward.
Yeah, and I feel like a huge part of that is the ability to step back and be like objective and rational about what's happening, which is super hard
Yeah.
in like this is probably one of the hardest situations to have that orientation, because like you said, it's this, you get this immediate stress response, right? You have your amygdala and your stress hormones and your adrenaline are going, especially in those really intense arguments. And that makes it harder to clarify like what's true about the entire situation rather than what do I just feel right now. And often it's like we're just trying to get rid of that negative feeling rather than, or in like doing so by doing the way we do it is trying to win the argument or like beat the other person. It's like a competition. Whereas, when we step back and we do take that ownership, okay, where was I, what am I responsible for in this? What did I do that, maybe wasn't optimal? And that, I think that takes a certain amount of practice of being able to sort of dial down that stress response in the moment, or at least step back from it for a second.
No, and I think that there's a couple of really important things that I think that you highlighted that kind of lead us into our next topic too. One of the things that we get stuck in, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself with like brain stuff and everything, but we get very self-protective in these modes because it's threatening. When we get in these stress responses, when we get in these threat responses, our fight or flight mechanisms going, right? If you think about other species, protecting themselves is usually a physical thing, right? But we're also protecting ourselves psychologically. We're trying to protect our needs. We're trying to protect our values, the things that we hold really close to ourselves, that we identify with. And in those moments, that's all we're doing is getting into defensive mode. We're trying to say like, no, I'm not that thing that you're calling me. And I'm going to look for every evidence and everything that I can to win this argument. And that really brings us into this idea of, when you look at the conflict literature, they talk a lot about cooperation versus competition. And something that I really want to kind of highlight is to get you to reconceptualize the word competition, because a lot of people have this idea when you say competition that it's that like we're competing for some prize or whatever it is. But in this respect, competition is that I'm taking the stance of trying to win, and at the cost of you losing, right? That's my purpose in this conflict, is that I want to move this forward, saying that I'm going to take the power going forward. I'm going to win this. I'm going to have this solution, and it's going to be my win. Whereas cooperation, on the other hand, what we're really trying to work towards is this more collaborative thing that really requires perspective taking, that requires us to get out of that kind of amygdala type circuit, that stress response that we're in, and be able to use these higher resources that really require us to be in more of a safe space to actually use.
Yeah, and I guess to add on to that, like the flip side of that competition thing, some people approach it as I need to attack and win and beat the other person, whereas another person might see it as a competition, but like a win-lose situation, but they are taking the kind of yielding. I'm going to accommodate because I just want to get out of it, even if it means I lose the argument, even if it means I have to give up everything. I'll just, whatever. I'd rather have the, peace in quotes.
And a really important thing when we're thinking about like this competition versus cooperation, something we mentioned earlier was this idea of misperceptions, of us constantly thinking that we know the intent of the other person. They've done these really interesting research studies where they show that if you're taking a competitive stance, if you're trying to win, that you are wrong about the other person's stance like 70% of the time. But if you're taking a cooperative stance, you can usually predict what the other person wants up to like 70% of the time. And so it really shows the difference in the cognitive resources, the cognitive abilities that we have, depending on which of those stances that we're taking. And so when you're approaching the conflict, if you're approaching it from this really defensive mode of saying like I need to prove to you that you're wrong, that is not going to move things forward in a productive way. And so I think now we can maybe get into the different styles. And Andrew kind of hinted at one of them, this idea of accommodation, of yielding, is a big one. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, of saying like, I don't like the conflict process. I hate it. It feels like friction inside of my body. A lot of times things get worse whenever conflict comes up. And so, you know what? I'm just going to sacrifice my needs in order to just get this thing squashed and move things forward.
Yeah. And I feel like some of these that we'll talk, all of these styles that we talk about, it might be that you approach like conflicts with different people in different ways. Like maybe with your, your parents, you go for the accommodating or yielding style, or competing, or with your partner, you're maybe more avoidant or something. But yeah, I think probably we each have like our own like typical style that we approach it with.
Totally. I think that there's nature nurture kind of idea wrapped up in here. Our style, our approach that we take into a conflict has a lot to do with our temperament, our personality, whether we're assertive or not, whether we have some type of dominant traits of really wanting and being willing to express our needs and talk about our needs. That can be really beneficial because we're being proactive about saying what we want, saying what we need. But if you're over assertive, if you have that competing style, that fighting style, that can really damage relationships. Because if you're constantly asserting your needs on someone, you're not giving them the ability to really talk about their needs as well, right? And the flip side of that, the accommodating side, when you're constantly yielding, you're constantly giving up your own needs, that's actually viewed in the literature as a positive form of conflict resolution because it actually does move things forward, but it leaves you kind of disenfranchised. It leaves you in this position of never really having your needs met because you're constantly saying sorry. You're constantly kind of giving up to the demands of the other person. And so we've talked about, you can come back and listen. We have a whole episode on power. And next week, we're actually going to do a whole discussion trying to put all of these pieces together because there's a lot going on with power dynamics between the competing style and the accommodating style, that usually the assertive person is more competing and the submissive person is usually a lot more accommodating.
Yeah, and I mean, the problem, I guess, with calling it a positive conflict resolution full stop is that resentment you're talking about. Like seems like it will breed resentment if you are constantly the one, being, for lack of a better term, being the doormat, I guess, in this situation. I just wanted to mention briefly, we have a little bit of activity in the chat on YouTube, but wherever you're watching this, definitely throw us any questions you might have. I have a couple here that are a little bit off topic, but I guess one of them is really closely related. I wonder what happens in our brains when we're talking to people. That's something we've talked about a little bit in an episode on empathy that we've had, and I recently had a video on communication and interbrain synchrony, and we've talked a lot about this kind of stuff. So we have more content specifically on that, but when it comes to conflict, we'll also be talking about that later on in the episode.
And so there's two other styles, and one of them we've really hinted at, and that's the avoidant style, right? So these are people that have experienced really negative conflict in their past, right? That have a really strong aversion to the conflict itself. They have really low windows of tolerance, right? So that means that like they tend to get really upset easily when things happen, and so they want to kind of step away from the conflict. And this will kind of keep things steady, right? But it's kind of a walking on eggshells approach. It's saying that like I'm just kind of hoping that this conflict goes away. And I really like what Andrew said earlier, because we really don't just like we're dominant in one of these styles, but we do use these different styles with different types of people, with past experiences with that person, right? Every time I try to avoid conflict with that person, it blows up. And so I'm just not going to approach conflict with that person anymore. I'm just going to avoid it and push it under the rug. whereas some other people may have more of a cooperative stance when we approach them. And so we're more willing to kind of take this last stance of being cooperative with them, of trying to have these conversations, of trying to get vulnerable. But what we're really trying to highlight is that we need to try to be taking the cooperative stance as much as we can, because we need to be voicing our own needs, right? But we also need to be respecting the needs of someone else. And so you have competing and accommodating, right? Being really assertive about your needs is really beneficial. Kind of listening to someone else's needs is also really beneficial. But if you can put the two of those together, it can be really powerful. And it takes a lot of cognitive resources to be able to do that, to be able to understand where I am and what my kind of values and needs and all of these things are, from like a protective place, right? When I'm in that kind of heightened mode of saying, this is what I need. But then it's another thing entirely to say, how do my needs then fit with yours? And do I really understand where you're coming from? Do I understand your needs? And that there's so much going on in the brain and the body when we're engaging in all of that.
Yeah, and it seems like to get into that collaborative approach, I feel like it just keeps coming back to on kind of that like initial fundamental level, like being able to dial down your own stress response and being able to like engage those cognitive faculties. That's something you have to practice. I think even outside of conflict, just in stressful situations in general, it's just paramount to be able to step away and think about what the other person is thinking and what their actual goals and values are in this and needs in this situation are. But I think that's just a hard thing to do, but it's something that the more you practice it, probably the better we get.
And we have an entire episode on theory of mind and empathy. That's something that Andrew mentioned earlier that really gets into. I mean, there's a part of our brain back here, the temporal parietal junction, that's specifically used. The researchers think is specifically used for thinking about the minds of other people, for taking the perspectives of other people. And it's because of the language that we use throughout our lives, talking about, I wonder if that's what he wants, or why do you think he's doing that, right? The more we engage in that kind of communication, the more we talk about those kind of things, the more our brain starts to realize that it can create these models of other people. It can create models of other people's minds. But this brain region is part of the default mode network. And the default mode network usually is not kind of on and active when we're highly engaged and highly emotional, right? The default mode network is there when we're just kind of relaxed and we're thinking about things, right? Just kind of taking it easy. It's actually the mind wandering kind of brain network. And so that's really what we're trying to engage in a lot of these situations. And so I think the next thing that we really want to kind of understand is what's going on in the brain and the body when we go through these things. But how do we get there? How does that escalation process look? The kind of reciprocity that's there. Are you okay, Andrew? Oh, gotcha. Yeah, no, I'm not. Yeah, cool. No, I'll keep moving forward. So one of the things that's really important to conceptualize and understand is the law of reciprocity, that it's what our kind of social society is built on. And you see this in other animals too. You see this in the greater apes, in any kind of social animal that has these like social hierarchies and everything, is that they're built on reciprocity, that when I do something positive for you, that you do something positive back for me. And when I do something negative to you, you usually have some type of revenge motive to do something negative to me. And this is actually the reason why alpha males and like these chimp groups and everything are not always the biggest. And it's because they have created a coalition around them, because they've said like, you know what, I'll groom you if you groom me, and I'll protect you if you protect me. And they've created this kind of cadre around them. What is really important, kind of considering the reciprocity though, is that there's this law of rough reciprocity, that when we do something positive for someone, when we smile at someone, they'll smile back, right? But when we do something negative to someone, there's actually usually a lot more reciprocity. There's way more for negative stuff than there is for positive stuff. And that's usually what leads to a lot of the escalation.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm back. All right. Yes, perfect. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder if it might have to do with like stress and anxiety neurophysiology, where when we're in that state of fight or flight, like we're talking about, when we're in this like negative, we feel like we have to defend ourselves in some way. Our brains are really there's a filtering mechanism on our perception, where we are searching, or we are maybe even only seeing the threatening information at the expense of the positive stuff. So, if you're feeling threatened, or you're feeling like some value is at stake, something is going to go wrong, you're more likely to see even like a mix of positive and negative information. You're going to be more likely to interpret that as wholly negative, or really just pick out the pieces that are negative. And then, of course, if that's your mindset, then all you're seeing is the negative, and you're going to throw it right back at that person.
And I mean, this really kind of sets the stage for why misperception is the norm in these situations, right? When we're in this super heightened state. And so think about like fight or flight, right? Is that we are now, like Andrew was saying, let's say the fight mode, right? Let's say that we've gotten into fight mode. We're engaged, right? We are so hyper focused, and so much of that is evolutionary, is has an evolutionary basis, right? In terms of our threat circuits, our threat processes are conserved through evolution. And a lot of the threat has been around actually finding threatening things in the world, right? I'm about to be attacked. I'm about to be attacked by a predator, or I'm about to be attacked by someone that's a higher status in my ape troop, or whatever it is, right? And so I go into this mode of really hyper focusing on those things that are coming at me. And when you're in fight and having this hyper focus, it allows you to have better aim, to dodge. It has better aim to fight back, right? But all of these past kind of species that we evolved from didn't have language, right? And so now these same filter processes, these same attention processes that were filtering out kind of salient visual information, are now filtering out kind of these cognitive semantic type things, where all we're honing in on are those things that we need to dodge, and those things that we need to kind of hit back at, right? And there's no awareness of the actual intent of the other person.
Yeah, I feel like that's so that like really hits home for me, because I definitely notice myself, like if I'm getting heated in an argument with my fiance, I'm like, sometimes I just realize, like, are you really listening? Are you really like being objective about this? Because there's like a moment, I feel like, where you can almost notice that, like, oh, they said something, and then you almost like can almost consciously feel yourself interpreting it in the worst possible light.
And so one of my favorite things to kind of think about and to study is attention, are these filtering processes, because they're fascinating, right? Like, and one of the things we've talked about this at length throughout this show is that our attention is so intimately linked to our goals. And if our goal in that moment is that I need to defend myself, the brain is only going to be looking for information that confirms what I need to defend, right? And so I'm going to be picking out every little bit of information that person says that supports my side. And I'm not going to be looking for anything that's about their goals, about what they want, right? And it's really hard to step out of that. You have to transform your goal in that moment. If your goal is to defend yourself, you need to think like, okay, is that the right goal to have right now? Or should the goal be that I need to approach this from a collaborative standpoint? I need to have a goal of trying to understand that person. And I need to convince my brain that that's what's important to me right now, is trying to understand that person. And it'll recalibrate these attention mechanisms. It'll recalibrate the way that I'm bringing in that information, the way that I'm filtering it and interpreting it. Because so much of the time, what is kind of gray at the beginning, as soon as someone takes a stance, it becomes firm commitment. And any kind of reason, any kind of logic just kind of goes out the window, right? That's a huge hallmark of conflict. I think is very tied into a lot of these processes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So like, you mean like people, once they land on something, they stick to their guns, kind of?
Yeah, and you see this. I mean, this was if you go back to our influence episode, this is an influence tactic that if you can get someone to
Yeah.
commit to something out loud, if you can get them to say like, yeah, you know what, that does sound kind of nice, then all of a sudden you've got this like this private this thing that's been said out loud that for them they don't want to appear as being wrong or be a liar or anything like that. And so they then have to defend these things that they put out there because now they've committed to it. They've kind of taken a stance on something. And so when you're in these heightened positions, that becomes part of those self-protective mechanisms. That my things that I've said, I don't want to appear as a liar. I don't want to appear as someone who's kind of misrepresenting myself. And so now I'm protecting those core values when really that thing that I'm fighting about is probably not kind of paramount and is actually probably pretty gray.
Yeah, it's when like our desire for consistency overrides the desire for truth, I guess.
Yeah, totally. And so I think that this kind of leads into some other stuff. I mean, one of the things about escalation, I think it's really important to know, and I think a lot of people can relate to, is that the original kind of beginning of escalation is usually there's overmatched threat, right? So if I say something that is really negative that you kind of take personally, then you are going to overmatch that coming back. And that's going to escalate the process. But as we move through conflict and as things get really heated, you'll actually start to see a lot of undermatching. That there's kind of like a need, like you're starting to recognize, like, we need to bring this down. And so there's more conciliatory type messages. Those are really important to look for. And those are really important to kind of say, like, okay, maybe we do need to kind of calm this down, take a step back, whatever it may be. And this leads us into really talking about like what is going on in the body during all of this escalation, what's going on in the brain while we're trying to communicate. We've kind of hinted at a lot of it, but
Yeah. Yeah, we keep mentioning the fight or flight response, and really what we're talking about is like this natural like circuitry that we all have, that it really comes down to activating our sympathetic nervous system, right? And well, that's really one part of it. That's kind of the autonomic part. That's the part that makes you feel like your heart is racing or your stomach is tied in knots. Your vision narrows, actually. Yeah, tunnel vision. And that's all a result of the engagement of these some of the brain regions we've already mentioned, like the amygdala. But it's not just the amygdala. And I also don't. I want to like. I always have to give this caveat that the amygdala is not just. It's not the fear center. It's not what creates emotions, but it's really important for drawing our attention to important things in the environment, and then kind of helping us to select a response to that. But there's a lot going on in the brain that then triggers this downstream effect on our bodies, where we feel this urge to do something, to go. And that's kind of what stress is all about, getting us to go do something, whether it's fight or flee, or even in a more positive sense, like getting stuff done, or being productive, or even saving someone from drowning or something like that. But it's all about, that's why your body has that sensation of unpleasant sensation typically.
We're constantly on a teeter-totter between being in a position where we can relax, where we can digest food, where we can really rest and like take care of ourselves and recuperate, or we're in a very active state, right? We're engaged, and at the extreme, we're threatened, right? And our body has to respond in different ways to those different types of things. It has to send resources to different places in our body, depending on those two different things. And something that Andrew is hinting at that's really important to kind of recognize is that the amygdala is a lot of the time talked about in terms of all of these kind of things because it's situated in a really important place in the brain, because it's kind of a position between kind of the cognitive stuff that's going on and all of the physiological stuff. And so it's able to kind of notice like there's something going on cognitively that's threatening. And so I'm going to take a step. I'm going to take a leap out there. The amygdala response is a lot faster than the cognitive response. It's really important to recognize. It recognizes threat before you've had time to think about whether it actually is a threat. And so because of that, it's actually preparing the body for that threat. And that's really kind of adaptive, if you think about it, right? It's a lot better of a strategy to overreact to something than to underreact. Because if you underreact to an actual threat, you can die, right? And so the amygdala's kind of role in all of this is to get the body ready in case there is a threat while the brain is catching up and actually thinking about things. But that means all of those uncomfortable things that are happening to our body, our muscles start to get tight. I mean, you can tell, like, when you're in conflict, your fists are clenched, right? You feel tense. And that's because your muscles are getting ready for an actual fight. You have all of the blood is rushing away from your digestive system. It's rushing to your muscles so that you can either take something on or you can run away, right? And all of the resources in the brain are being reallocated, right? And so you're using the parts of your brain that are important for those survival situations rather than using the parts of the brain that are usually on when you are resting and digesting and doing those things, right? That's why I mentioned the default mode earlier. Default mode network, we found that network by accident. And we found it by accident because it was what came on when we weren't doing anything, when we were just laying there, just thinking about whether we took the trash out yesterday or whatever. But those regions in the default mode network are the really important ones for a lot of the cognitive work that we've been talking about, of really kind of thinking through social situations, thinking about things that happened in the past and how they impact the future. Because the stuff that's going on when you're in threat is here and now. It's I'm engaged in this threat right now. The default mode is, I really need to think about what happened last week or a month ago or a year ago that really set up all of this stuff. And what is it that I can do to then maybe think about consequences in the future, right? Putting those pieces together requires a lot more calm than being in this really heightened state.
Yeah, that's that's really important. And with the amygdala, there's while there's some good to what I'm about to say, it's also a little oversimplified. So, like, a lot of time when we talk about this kind of thing, it's like the amygdala and the PFC are like enemies, because the prefrontal cortex
Yeah.
is this rational, logical, supercomputer and then the amygdala is just like this, what id,
Dramatic
yeah,
teenager.
crazy, wild animal that lives under our cortex and just gets us going. But there's also, interestingly, about with stress and anxiety and this kind of fight or flight thing we're talking about, the amygdala, it doesn't just override the prefrontal cortex and kind of take over the brain. It actually has a way of influencing the prefrontal cortex to instantiate a goal, right, that is based on avoiding or fighting or getting away from threat in some way. So it actually,
Like that.
in that moment, can have that backward influence on the prefrontal cortex to tell it to recruit all these other brain regions to engage us in the fight or flight mode, the kind of stress physiology we're talking about. But then it's also true that the prefrontal cortex has a really unique influence over the amygdala and its ability to turn down its activity. It has this circuit that goes straight to this inhibitory region of the amygdala that can really dramatically reduce its activity. And so that's that's why I keep coming back to this ability to step back and turn down our stress response is so important for our ability to engage in arguments, in conflict productively, and step back and be objective and think about the other person's values and our shared values and the actual goals that we want to strive for.
I think you touched on something really important, and that's the fact that we as humans are so much more deliberative than any other species on this planet. And when I say deliberative, what I mean is that we're able to hold different things in our mind at the same time. We're able to weigh different things and decide which one we want to prioritize. And I think something really important that Andrew was just hinting at is that in that moment, when the amygdala is sending the signal to the prefrontal cortex, it's telling the prefrontal cortex, it's biasing it. It's saying, you should really focus on this. You should make goals around this, right? Because this right now, we need to defend ourselves. Like, this is important. But the really cool thing about the prefrontal cortex is that it can hold competing goals at the same time. But it takes a time to actually be able to go through that deliberative process to say, like, okay, yeah, this, I hear you. I hear you, amygdala. Like, this is really important. I get it. I get it. I can feel the body, like everything that's going on. But there's also this stuff, right? But that really requires you to be able to step out of that and to be able to, and so much of that circuitry from the prefrontal cortex to the midbrain stuff is regulatory. It's saying like, okay, I get it. I get it. All right, now calm down because we're good. It wasn't a snake. It was a stick. Like, we processed it. We thought about it. We're good. Right. And that really kind of takes time, because so many of you can relate to the fact that once you start the process of getting all of these endorphins and these hormones and stress things going, you've kind of like kicked something into gear. And now you're able to regulate that. You're able to say like, okay, I'm good. But now you have to then wait for all of that to clear out of your entire body. Because like all of that is still now sending signals back up to your brain, where your body's still like, yeah, but my heart's still beating, and like, and I'm still tense. Like, are you sure we're okay? Are you sure? Like,
That's so true. And I actually, maybe like that's a good transition to like some of these, the way that we can more productively deal with conflict. And just starting out with that, like, okay, you're feeling this sympathetic nervous system activation. You're feeling this fight or flight response, stress response. Maybe the first like tool we can touch on, like how to turn that down in the moment, is something I learned from Andrew Huberman, who I learned a lot of things from his podcast, the Huberman Lab, where he talked about the physiological sigh, which is this just breathing exercise that you can do in a matter of like 30 seconds or even less, that has a powerful effect directly on the sympathetic nervous system, actually through your heart, the way that blood is flowing through your heart. It's really interesting. But basically, I'll try to do this on camera. So you take a double breath in through your nose, like, and then a slow exhale through your mouth. And maybe even just hearing me do that was just therapeutic and really relaxing for people out there.
oh, I lost your audio again, Andrew. Oh, so I'm gonna talk. So the other really important thing in all of this is that in order to engage in that, in order to even do that breath, there has to be a recognition that we've gotten there in the first place. You really have to have this reflexive process in the moment to be able to say like, you know what, I'm at way too high of a level right now emotionally to be engaging in this conflict in general. There's a lot of stuff that they use in like the counseling world and things like that, where they have like thermometers that are like, from 0 to 10, this is my emotional level right now. You don't have to have a physical one present, but conceptualize that. Think about it. Think about where you are from 0 to 10. And what a lot of the researchers say is that if you're over a 7 on this scale, do I gotcha?
I hear.
Okay. So I'm talking about like a thermometer. They use these in counseling, where it's a 0 to 10, where you're at emotionally. And you don't have to have a physical copy of it, but if you can conceptualize the idea of it, what they say is that if you're over a 7, you probably don't have the cognitive resources to have a productive conflict resolution. And so if you're going to engage in these regulatory processes, the first kind of thing that you have to do is to really recognize that there's a need for that in the first place. And to be able to, in that moment, say, you know what, we need to take a break. We need to step back. There's someone named Sarah Payton that devised this thing called the window of tolerance, that's really kind of based on this idea of like the 0 to 10 model, that once you're outside of that tolerance zone, you're in complete fight or flight shutdown, right? The other one that we didn't really talk about was freeze. And I think a lot of people can relate to the freeze response in conflict, that instead of being in this situation where we feel like we're ready to fight or we're ready to run away or whatever that is, we're actually semi-paralyzed, right? We have this immobility. We have this inability to even engage at all. We're hyper vigilant on whatever's going on, right? So like we have all of the information coming in, but we're not able to respond to it at all. And that it's really important to identify when you're slipping into these modes, when your body is disconnecting your ability to engage cognitively.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, cool.
Yeah, I got
Yeah, I
you.
apologize for my audio issues. My microphone just keeps dying for some reason. Um, but yeah, that's a really great point. I think I missed the first part of it, but um, yeah, it sounds like checking your level of escalation in
Yeah.
in the conflict, and being able to bring that down within yourself, right? Like it's not trying to tell the other person calm down, because that typically doesn't work, right?
So the other thing that I think is really important in these moments is that so much of the time, things start as what is usually considered like task or process conflict, right? We're fighting about something that we want to change, about how we do something, about how we do the dishes or how we do the laundry or how we engage in the thing at work or whatever it is. And oftentimes, when those things are criticized, we take it personally. We think that the person is actually attacking us, and that invokes a lot of these defense mechanisms. And so it's really important to and we've been saying this through the whole episode, but to really understand intent and perceptions and all of these. And some of the communication strategies around this are really trying to voice to the other person what kind of story you're hearing, right? Like,
Mm.
the story that I'm telling myself when you did this was that you really just don't think that I'm competent, that you don't think that I'm able to do these things. And the person might respond, I think that you're amazing at what you do. I just, there's something that I don't like about the style with this particular thing, but it has nothing to do with your work ethic or anything like that, right? But it puts things into a mode where you're saying, you know what, I feel like there's misperception and I feel like I'm miscommunicating something, and you're not attacking them, right? You're not saying like you don't do things, you're terrible at telling me or whatever, because you're just evoking defense.
Yeah. And I feel like that really takes that ability to think about what's really going on kind of deeper on a deeper level in your own mind. Like it's sometimes hard to realize like, oh, I'm feeling attacked because, or I'm feeling like I have to strike back because I think, you're attacking my competence or my you're giving me you think that I'm a bad person. And like it can sound so weird when you say it just straight out like that, but it's often I feel like our own insecurities are underlying a lot of our like striking back at people because we're putting motives into their mind that are a reflection of negative beliefs we have about ourselves.
I think that's a really great segue into so Claire Canfield that we mentioned earlier. He's got this great TED talk. He actually put together this whole theory around conflict communication. He's the really great mediator, works in Utah, and he created this acronym called VOCAB. And it was about how you can really move a lot of this conflict forward. But the counterintuitive part of a lot of this is that it's really more about you. It's about you getting in touch with things that are important to you and really trying to figure out, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of this conflict is like an iceberg, right? So much of what we're fighting about is like way up here on the surface. And so V is vulnerability, is really getting in touch with yourself about why it is that this thing is upsetting you. He gave this great example of like the dishes, and he had always had this problem with the dishes. Like his mom always had conflict with him about doing the dishes, and then he went to college and he had this conflict with his roommates about dishes, and then he had conflict with his wife about dishes and with his kids about dishes. And then he started to think about it and he said, you know, it's not about the dishes. It's about I feel like I'm unrecognized when these other people aren't doing their share, right? I feel like there's not justice here, that there's some unfairness in all of this. And it's really those really deep principles that are driving a lot of what's going on. And if you can get in touch with that vulnerability, if you can say, you know what, this is why I'm so emotional about this. These are the reasons. The next one is ownership. It's really kind of owning all of that, right?
Yeah, owning your own values, right? Your own like, and I think also part of ownership is right, like owning your own part in the conflict too. That owning your reactions that maybe weren't calibrated, right? There's a lot
Owning your
of ownership
emotions.
going on. Yeah, owning your emotions. Yeah.
And I mean, so much of the time, they actually talk about a lot. There's three different roles that we can take on in conflict, and one of them is the villain, where it's that person that's just the cause of all of the suffering in my life. Like, if only the villain were gone, then everything would be good in my life, right? And then you have the victim, the one that's just completely blameless, that it's just everything is just happening to me. It's all my fault. These are usually people that are talking to everyone about the conflict except the person that the conflict actually needs to be talked about with. And then you have the savior, the one that's just trying to fix everything all the time and is actually inserting themselves into conflict when they shouldn't be, and all of this, right? Uh, and the biggest, this really hit me when I was listening to some of these talks. The biggest thing across the board with all of these different roles is that every single one of those roles, they feel like there's no blame. They feel like they're justified in their role, that they're justified in their assertiveness, they're justified in their victimhood, they're justified in their need to save people, and that there's no blame that should be associated with them. And that's a huge part of all of this, is really understanding, like, yes, there are villains, victims, and saviors, right? What we're talking about is the role you're assuming in the conflict to avoid the conflict, right? And it's really in those moments that ownership is so important, of really trying to understand, like, why is it that I'm taking that role? Why is it that I have all of these emotions and all of these feelings and these values and these needs? And why is it that I'm not communicating them?
Yeah, that's really it's really good to think about, like, if you're playing one of those roles in a conflict. Um, yeah, I think the villain can sound like it's almost like not even a realistic thing, but the reality is, I feel like victims or villains often feel like they want revenge. They want, like, to sabotage the relationship, or something about the relationship, because they feel it's almost like they're the victim who turned into, like, the villain over time.
I think that a lot of the times the people that are in the villain role have this cognitive dissonance about them too, because they don't want to be viewed as the bad guy. They don't want to be viewed as the villain, but they still feel like they're kind of justified in seeking some type of kind of revenge type conflict. So we have vulnerability, ownership. C is communication. And I think that this is by far the most important. This is what I think this entire episode has been about, is about really, after you've been able to understand your role in this and what you need and what you want, and really getting vulnerable, then you need to be able to communicate those things in a healthy way to that other person, in a state of mind that isn't escalated, right? Because the whole point of the communication point is to really align with one another. We haven't really brought it up because it's kind of, there's conflicting results around it, but there's this really interesting research about synchrony, about our brains actually getting on the same wavelength, about them looking like they're processing the same kind of information. There's some results that we found when we were doing this research that say that, like, romantic couples are more aligned during, like, conflict, but it was more about, like, arousal, that they were both in heated situations, so their brains were kind of mirroring each other. But I've actually seen some research that shows that these regions of the brain that we're actually concerned about, the regions that are for perspective taking, the default mode regions, those regions seem to be really aligned when we're cooperating, when we're really on the same page, when things are level and we're understanding each other. They've actually shown during, like, competitive games, the people that are competing with each other are not in line with one another, but the people that are on the same team are, right? And so, and you can feel that when you are, like, on the same wavelength as someone, it has a visceral feeling associated with it. It's like, yes, I feel understood. That's really what you're trying to get to with a lot of the communication.
Yeah, yeah, and that research about romantic couples being more in sync during conflict. I think one of the issues with that was, yeah, the brain region they were looking at was I think the premotor cortex. So,
Which makes
you
sense.
know, yeah, I guess so. Yeah,
I gotta give a shout out, Einsteiner2. Hello from Sweden. That is so cool that you're
super
listening from
cool.
Sweden. Yeah, thank you for chiming in on the chat. So we
Awesome.
have vocab: vulnerability, ownership, communication. A is acceptance. And this is a really tricky one for a lot of people, because this is really accepting what it is that you can't change, right? Accepting what it is that you have power over, what it is that you can change in yourself, that you can change in the relationship, and accepting those things that you can't, right? And that is something that really, I think, gets visceral, that gets personal for a lot of people, is that we have this really strong desire for control. And if you can take that desire for control out of the equation and really practice a lot of kind of radical acceptance in the moment, it can be really helpful at moving the dial in the right direction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think and we want to be like careful to avoid that. We're not saying just accept whatever terms are offered to you
No.
in the in the argument. It's more like accepting what is, what
Yeah.
is real, what is actually happening, and accepting, like Taylor said, it's the serenity prayer that you grant me the something to change the things I can, and accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference, something like
Yes,
that.
yes.
Somebody will correct me, I'm sure.
But this goes hand in hand with the last letter. So we have vocab, right? Vulnerability, ownership, communication, acceptance. The last one is boundaries. And this one is probably one of the hardest things to invoke, to set. But this is the point of conflict. The point of conflict is to build structure in the relationship. It's to make the relationship more predictable so that these things don't happen in the future. And you can't prevent things from happening in the future without actually defining what it is you're okay with and what it is that you're not okay with, right? Setting boundaries, like, you know what? In conflict, in our communication, it's not acceptable for you to talk to me that way. And if that's the way that you're going to talk to me, then I'm going to leave the conversation, right? It's setting these clear kind of rules around how our relationship is going to move forward. I mean, it can be around communication, but it can also be around like the task that you were fighting about, right? It's like, okay, you know what? I understand now where you were coming from, that you took ownership for your feelings around wanting to be recognized. And that's really what's under the surface with this whole dish thing that's going on. You know what? How about we set something up in the future where like I do this and you do that, and we set kind of rules and structure and boundary around it, so that you do feel recognized, right? Bringing it back to the actual values that were there in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of people have issues setting boundaries, like, myself included, with
Yeah, me too.
family members, especially, because I think you grow up and you have this almost like sense of obligation, sometimes, that I think when you are not, when you're feeling like you're doing something for someone else, out of like a sense of duty, rather than it being a real reflection of your values, it is really easy to skirt the issue of boundaries and just say like that doesn't matter. I'm or it'll just lead to more problems than it'll solve. And I think that's when you got to really take a critical look at what are those relationships, what do they really mean to you, what's the value that they represent, and uh, you know you should be setting, or I mean, for your own good, setting these healthy boundaries is the best thing you can do, and actually, like, for the health of the relationship, probably the best thing you can do.
There's a guy on YouTube, Jimmy on relationships. He's fantastic. Kind of ridiculous at times, but really good. He's got amazing stuff about a lot of this conflict and everything. And something really struck me in one of the videos that I watched with him around boundaries. And he said, boundaries are only unhealthy to unhealthy relationships. If setting a boundary is going
Yeah.
to end a relationship, then it's because that relationship is unhealthy, right? Because the boundary itself is supposed to protect your needs. It's supposed to be you saying like, this is what's important to me. This is what I value. And this is what I need recognition and respect and anything around in order to kind of continue through in this relationship. And if that's something that prompts negativity, that prompts any type of gaslighting or anything like that, there's a problem there. And that's that person is maybe in a very competitive stance that doesn't recognize that you have needs that need to be met in that relationship as well.
Yeah, yeah, that it can be also just that competitive stance, or like, they may not even know they're doing this, but using, like, could be using you for some end for themselves, and that's when it's extremely important to set those boundaries. But I think that's often when it's the hardest for people to set those boundaries, because it's like, if they're not aware that this is a problem in the relation, that this relationship is unhealthy, then it can just seem like it's a total loss to even go into any kind of boundary setting or any kind of conflict. It looks like Taylor's video froze a little bit, but I think you're back. There we go. Oh, cool.
No, so I think the biggest thing with boundaries is to tell someone forward that most important to say about relationships before we kind of on are only kind of successful if you actually uphold the boundary. If you set a boundary, this is what I need going forward, and that happens again, and you don't actually uphold it, actually upholding the boundary.
It's a boundary, right? It's not just a suggestion. It's a fence. It's a line in the sand that when it's crossed, there's some kind of consequence.
And the thing about change, right? You're having something that needs to change in the relationship. We have a whole episode on neuroplasticity that I think is super related to all of this. And that's the fact that change is really hard. Like it's one thing to talk about it, but change takes repetition. It takes consistent practice of doing that thing over and over and over again, because our brains are very tempted to go to the natural way that we've been doing things. And so all of these things that we've been talking about really bringing these conflict strategies into your life, they take practice. They take doing these things over and over again, in having the consequence of a boundary instilled over and over and over again, to the point that that new behavior starts to become more automatized, starts to become something that you're naturally falling into. You're naturally communicating this way. You're naturally reflecting on your emotions and your values and your needs, and you're taking ownership and you're accepting things. Those are things that take practice. They take really rewiring a lot of these old ways of doing things and the way that you've conceptualized conflict, and really kind of transforming it. It's like learning a new language.
Yeah, and something we mentioned earlier, the consistency principle, where when you publicly commit to something, you want to remain consistent with what you said, and so you can kind of take advantage of that in yourself. That you may have set these boundaries like mentally in your head, but if you don't actually state them to another person, it's a lot easier to kind of fool yourself into thinking that they're not so important, and I'll let them cross the boundary this time, and maybe next time I won't. But yeah, and I think for me, like, the biggest takeaway with this conversation would be to, like, challenge yourself when you find yourself in a heated conflict, to step back, to dial down your stress response, and to really, really ask yourself, what is at stake here for me, and what is the other person, what's at stake for them, and just taking that, I think, overall objective stance toward it. This just really trying to listen and to focus on what's actually happening, and understanding the context that it's arising in. It's tough, but I think, like, the more we practice it, the better we get. And yeah.
I think a strategy with that, and before I kind of end as well, something that's been really helpful for me is in those really heightened moments when we do need to step away. If you have this urge to say something, to send something, right? We've all had those moments where we create this like super angry text and send it. Write down all of those things that you're super angry about, and don't send it, and wait for your stress response to come down, and then reread it, and really think about whether or not those things are important things that need to be said, or whether they're inflammatory, whether they're escalatory, whether they're actually considering the other person's needs. That can be really helpful in bringing these things down. So I think the really important thing that for me that stood out in this conversation is that we really all need to reconceptualize what conflict is. If you can go into the conflict knowing that the purpose of conflict is growth, is really kind of this catalyst for change, if you can understand the beauty of the conflict and understand that most of the time when we successfully navigate a conflict, it actually brings us closer together, right? We've all had those moments where it's just like, we just got through it. We just had this really amazing moment, and now we're so much stronger because of it. Those are the things that we need to keep in mind. And we need to realize that the more we avoid these things, the more we yield and accommodate, and the less that we try to actually collaborate and cooperatively work through these things, the more it's going to build resentment. And there's always going to be this tension, this elephant in the room. And it's really hard to kind of find the strength and the courage to bring that stuff to the surface, but it's so freaking worth it. So that's what I got for you.
Love it. Well, that's about our time. Thank you all for listening and for the activity in the chat. I love it. I'll just throw up our QR code for our Patreon. Again, if you want to help support us, go to patreon.com/thesocialbrain.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah. The link is in the description. So yeah, wherever you're watching or listening to this, definitely check out our Patreon. You can help support us, help keep this show going. We want this to be free as possible to people. We want to produce content that's free to consumers, but it's also, the reality is we both have other jobs outside of this, and we need your support, and it will be, it'll help us build a better show too.
Imagine how good this would be if this was our job.
We'd be so much better at this.
No, we really appreciate everybody tuning in, the people that come back for more and more. We love doing this, and it has given us an opportunity to really synthesize and put all of this stuff together. Tune in next week. Our last 3 episodes: influence, power, and now conflict. We're going to do just kind of an open discussion between Andrew and I about how these things are connected to one another, and really kind of draw some parallels between all of this stuff. So we will see y'all next week.
Bring your questions too.
Yes,
and
yes.
If you're watching this afterwards on YouTube, definitely throw a question in the comments section on either of our pages. We'll try to address those, the ones related to what we're talking about, but also just come to the live and engage with the chat. And yeah, we'll catch you next time.
Cool. Thanks, guys.